Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this second morning edition of this webinar on the interaction and the relationship between affectation and COVID-19 pandemic and peace and security contemporary trends. Good debate and pretext to present the next edition of the master's degree in peace, security, arms conflict and security, which is co-organized by the same co-organizers of this webinar. Institute for Economics and Peace, and Blanquerna Faculty of Communications and International Relations. I'm Albert Carames, one of the coordinators of these masters, and I'll be here only to attend technical issues and manage all the possible questions you may have. For that, for the ones who are aware or wasn't aware on how this platform works, you will see on the bottom of this screen image, you will see that the option chat, where during the conference you can already post your questions that I'll manage to project and translate to the panelists, as well as the question and answers question. For sure, if there is any technical problem, please let me know, and I'll try even to use the chat to post additional information if necessary. With no further interruption, I'll pass the floor to the moderator of this seminar, which is Dr. Tom Woodhouse, which is one of the directors of the Master's Peace, Conflict and Security. Tom, whenever you want.
Thank you very much, Albert, and welcome everybody to this second webinar in our series, our morning session today. Thank you for joining us. My role is to moderate the session, as Albert explained, and to introduce our topic, why we're here and what we want to be talking about today, and also to introduce our presenters. We have two main presentations and the structure of the webinar. So we'll be aiming to run for about an hour, and in the first part we will be taking presentations from our two panelists. I will introduce them shortly, and in the second part we will be having an open Q&A and discussion. I think, as Albert suggested, on the chat button you can post your questions or comments at any time from now, and we will line them up and take them in the second part of the webinar. So, by way of introduction, Albert mentioned that my name is Tom Woodhouse. I'm my main career still is actually at the University of Bradford in the UK, where I've been involved with the work of the Peace Studies Department there, specifically in directing the work around conflict resolution and training related to conflict resolution. I'm also a visiting professor at the Blanquerna campus of Ramon Llull University in the Faculty of Communications and International Relations. And that's the faculty which hosts the master's degree program in Peace, Conflict and Security Studies, which is one of the main drivers for our seminar. We want to tell you what the master's is about, and then around that ask the bigger question about the impact of the COVID pandemic on peace, conflict and security studies. So our master's degree is entitled precisely that, Peace, Conflict and Security Studies, and it's coming to the end of its first year and with its first cohort, and then we're lining up now to go into a second iteration of that degree. I'm, in addition to being a visiting fellow at Blanquerna, I'm also a member of the International Advisory Council of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And in fact, the origins of this master's degree came from both the university and IEP, who began to connect with each other through the director, through the overall chair of IEP, Steve Kilalea, when he visited Barcelona. And we looked into the possibility of having a degree which was co-organized by the University of Blanquerna, and also in partnership with a practice organization, the IEP, which is already very well known for its, if you like, its core brands, its Global Peace Index, its Positive Peace Index, its Global Terrorism Index, and a number of other very influential reports and publications, really looking at the economic costs of violence and the economic benefits of peace. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that when Serge Stroobants, who I will introduce shortly, makes his presentation. So we have three main kind of thematic questions which we will ask our panelists to address and which we will then open up in discussion. One is, what is the COVID-19 pandemic? What effect is it having on the world of peace and security? Secondly, how can academia, how can we in universities and researchers, how can we work in partnership together in order to provide solutions to the problems we face as we come out of this pandemic, as we face, for example, this term that's been used, what will the new normal look like? And it will have downsides, which we're probably already very aware of, but we also want to look at the positives. What can we build out of this, which makes us more secure and more peaceful? So our two presenters who will be starting shortly represent both the master's program, the academics, and the IEP. And I will introduce our panel now. Firstly, we have Dr. Valeria Bello, who is Associate Professor from Blanquerna in the Faculty of Communications and International Relations. Valeria is a member of the Governing Council of the European International Studies Association, which is one of the biggest networks of scholarly associations in the world devoted to international relations, international politics. And amongst other areas of interest, she is an expert in the field of migration, climate change, and international relations. Valeria will have 10 minutes, and I will time her. And when we had our seminar yesterday, she exactly performed to the 10-minute slot, maybe with a minute over time, but we can allow that. And she will be followed by Serge Stroobants. Serge is the director of IEP programs in Europe and Middle East, North Africa. He is a former colonel in the Belgian Armed Forces, and he's got academic specializations in political science, international relations, security, and defense. He also has extensive practical experience in peacekeeping missions internationally, so he very much can connect the theory-practice continuum. So by way of introduction, those are our two presenters, and I will now hand over to Valeria to take us into the first presentation for the moment. Valeria Bello, Blanquerna.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your kind introduction. And again, let me thank both you and Albert for inviting me to join this very interesting webinar. Yesterday, we have already considered, as you were mentioning, the challenges and the opportunities that this current pandemic is entailing for us, for our living conditions, for our times, and more generally for us as human beings on this planet. And therefore today what I would like to do is to particularly dwell on the liminality that we're living, and what are the specific opportunities that this situation enables us to bring into this world. So yesterday we started particularly with a consideration of how the three paradigms of national, international, and human security do not per se have to be taken as in tension among each other, and the fact that actually we're witnessing with the global pandemics that there is a new focus on human security, and this human security is a sort of link that we all have as inhabitants of this planet. We've also considered if we particularly focus on concept or frameworks of competition over equipment or over the needs and resources and products in our daily life as a sort of conflict between different parts, and we put at the margin of our life solidarity and cooperation, then what we will witness is indeed an increase in national security egoisms and a sort of retreatment from the multilateralism. And I'm sure that Serge will also explain this more in depth also today. And on the other side, we've already considered that the opportunities of this current situation are particularly the fact that we're witnessing that we can change specific dynamics, such as climate change action can truly take a significant step if we reconsider the growth model in terms of sustainability, that our environment can go back to a clean space that we can all enjoy as human beings, and that all the ideas that we had about the impossibility to improve our living conditions were only tied to specific products. We today perhaps better understand what are the needs and the basic interest that we have as inhabitants of this planet, and the specific elements that make us enjoy life truly, rather than focusing on elements that are only temporary and perhaps more connected to a specific framework of what is the current ways to frame life as individuals. So all these changes that we have witnessed and the challenges and opportunities bring us in a moment in which what we realize is that the importance of the way we act in this world is what will constitute the future tomorrow. But on the other side, it also shows, because it's a specific liminal time in which every given for granted grounds of our lives all of a sudden have been questioned, what we understand is that actually the ideas and the conditions that we have about the world and what is important are importantly embedded with the result of what we achieve and what we get in our lives. And therefore, in that sense, yesterday we looked at how importantly the emissions were controlled and reduced during these times. We have seen how the borders have been considered differently, and also in some ways paradoxically, we've seen several of this phenomenon, and we have considered the kind of importance that they could entail or not, depending on the framework we use to weight their relative presence in our life. Today, what I would particularly like to dwell on is the specific role that, once we have understood this, we have in constructing a new normality. So how that is somehow illustrated by this specific pandemics. I think we have all reconsidered the solidarity that we can find, also the technologies and the opportunities these technologies can provide us, because it would have been completely different the kind of life we would have lived in a pandemics without the specific technology. And we've also considered that we actually can play a role that is much more significant than what we thought as citizens. Therefore, this makes us understand that what we will have in the world of tomorrow, in the new normality, is what we will stress as they are the fundamental needs that we have as human beings. Therefore, there's possibly a momentum for finding new ideas, but also new conceptions of what we can do to construct our world in a different way, and how to phrase those threats and opportunities. If in the past we particularly focused on the anticipation of risks, and yesterday we considered, yes, Paul, thank you, we considered those risks and the consequences of treating true catastrophes at the same extent of the anticipation of catastrophes as in the ideas of Ulrich Beck and the risk society, and the way that we have lived the world as a constant protection from threats. And we've also seen that liberties and freedom is particularly freedom from fears, and the important role that factors such as education, health play when it comes to make us feel and be truly free from fears. Today, I want to stress the role of ideas and what we think the world of tomorrow will be in the construction of our future. Therefore, if we think that what we have really missed in this liminal situation is the encounter with others, is the presence and of others, and the exchange we had as human beings on the planet. And therefore we stress that in our new normality that will have a different consequence than rather stressing and highlighting the competition and the importance to accumulate specific products at the expense of others. And on the other side, as we have mentioned, the importance of climate change and what we have witnessed as a new environment. We also know that actually, if there is a new understanding of what could be the important component of our lives in terms of sustainability and our role as citizens, but also states and other actors that play a role in the governance of this planet. Therefore, we would bring that into our new scenarios and our new normalities. So we have to particularly focus on this positive element of the possibilities that ideas and new conditions and these new opportunities offer us for the future. And we perhaps will also in this way, rather than anticipating catastrophes, be better ready in the future for actually deal with concrete threats and concrete challenges that we could encounter, particularly when it comes to our planetary environment. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm definitely open to, I would welcome all of your comments and suggestions, and thank you very much for those. I'll leave it to Serge, who I'm sure will also dwell more on the terms of security and multilateralism. Thank you both, Paul and Serge, for accompanying me today.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Again, thank you for keeping expertly to time, concisely to time, and also for really stressing how it's really the role of action and agency, how we react to this crisis opens up windows of opportunity for some form of more secure or positive outcomes. And that really is a good link across to Serge, who will give a perspective, a broad perspective, but also a focused perspective on the Institute for Economics and Peace and how it relates to these issues. So Serge, I hand over to you for a second presentation. And please remember, everybody, you can post comments and questions as we go along. And Valeria certainly made a number of comments which will draw you into a discussion, or draw us all into a discussion. So please do participate on the chat. Serge, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much, Valeria, for another impressive contribution in the discussion. I think we discussed that at the very beginning of this seminar, and you spoke about this also, Valeria. I think we all agree that we are facing the same problem and facing the same crisis, but we also are experience different leaderships in the countries we come from, and we don't really see a global answer, or not as globalized as we could expect answer to this pandemic. What I see, and maybe a side note before starting my presentation, what I see is clearly that political leaders and governments now are starting to listen again to experts. And this is something I've lost over the past years and even over the past decades, is really integrating the advice of experts into political decision making. And I think this is one of the major evolutions that I've seen, especially here in Belgium with the Belgian government, but also throughout the EU, is to see that political leaders realize that they do not have a good sense of what's happening. I mean, it's very technical, and as I will explain later on, one of the vital interests of our societies are at stake, and therefore have a set of experts advising their decision making, but also eventual policy making. And I think that's one of the first major evolutions of the past weeks and months. What I will do first is talk a little bit about the crisis itself, look at the balance between preparedness and resilience. After that, I will talk about globalization, of deglobalization, the link to multilateralism, before, of course, looking at research, IEP research, and how it relates to COVID-19. And then we'll say a couple of words about the program, the master program itself, and IEP's position in there. COVID-19, is this a surprise for us? Is it normal that most of the countries have been surprised by COVID-19? Well, I don't think so. I think that if you open the time window to about 3 decades, starting in 1990 up to 2020, I think many of our societies have taken the peace dividends after the Cold War, but made a mistake, and that's not to reinvest those peace dividends in peace and security for our societies, but also for the global society. Together with this evolution, we also face globalization, and we also faced erosion of multilateralism. And those are the 3 things I'm going to talk about today. When I say we were not prepared, I think in most of the countries, and especially those countries that are really super interconnected at the middle of globalization, those were the countries that have been most affected by COVID-19. But those are also countries, especially Western countries, that have not been able in the past 3 decades to basically tackle the dissemination and the fragmentation of conflict worldwide, that have not really been able to prevent violent extremism leading to radicalization and terrorism. And I'm calling in from Brussels today, and we have been hit by this evil here in 2016. We have had a financial crisis also in the past 3 decades, and we have not been able to maybe take care of this or prevent this. And of course, this health crisis that we are going through today, we have been warned about this. I mean, we went through the SARS epidemic, also the MERS epidemic. Ebola has come back regularly, so we should have been prepared, but we weren't. And we can go on in this discussion also and talk about climate change and the effects of climate change, and I would say, the inadequacy to really come to a solution, or to at least a plan to be executed for, I would say, mitigating the effects of climate change. Just to give you an example of and Tommy, I've said I've been in the military for 30 years. One of the last major exercises that I helped plan and execute was for the European Army Corps based in Strasbourg. And we had a magnificent exercise in Luxembourg. And our idea was to receive the troops that would deploy by air into Luxembourg in a SARS, back in the days, in a SARS environment. So really be, with the protective gear, testing everybody, putting some in quarantine. And this initiative in this exercise has been stopped directly, day one, by one of the generals of the European Army Corps, a Spanish general. And it really struck my mind again at the very beginning when I saw that Spain was one of the countries most affected. And that communications and distribution of goods was affected also, to see that we had opportunities to train for this, and we had opportunities to be prepared, but we did not really always take this. And when I'm looking at our governments today, I see that no stockpiles were available, really, of those protective gears. I also saw, that's an example I gave yesterday, that, for example, the Belgian stockpiles, the small Belgian stockpile that were in protective gears, but it's not a stockpile, it's just like something you use to work with every day, was basically located in France. And at the very beginning of the crisis, when the border closed, Belgium had no access anymore to its protective gear. I also see that we're not prepared because no contingency plans were really available. I mean, when I look at how this crisis has been handled here in Belgium and in Europe, we clearly see that this was learning by doing, and the creation of task force and the creation of working groups that had to take all these crises into account, which leads to maybe wrong decisions and late reaction. For example, in Belgium, starting on Monday when shops will reopen, protective masks, mouth and those masks will be mandatory, but the government is unable to provide them before the 24th of May, which is 2 weeks later. So you clearly see that we were not really prepared to this type of crisis. On the other hand, I spoke about all those countries really interconnected and in the globalized world. Those are also the countries that are at the top of the positive peace index that the Institute for Economics and Peace is producing. So positive peace are the institutions, attitudes, and processes that you need to put in place to create, maintain, and sustain, and basically develop peace. Once this peace is developing, you will also get, as Thomas said in his introduction, the economic benefits. But next to the economic benefits, you will also see a positive evolution of your ecological, social, and governance indicators. And so those countries and these high levels of positive peace are also linked to higher levels of resilience. So non-prepared, but still able to cope with a situation like this and really mitigate the effects of a situation like this. This is what I am seeing in the region for which I am responsible. And that would be Europe, but also parts of the MENA region. I just read an article about Jordan that is showing that Jordan applied one of the toughest lockdown in the world, and really very early in the crisis. So Jordan really listened to what WHO has said, and really, declaring this state of emergency in pandemic late January, so global pandemic late January, and almost a couple of weeks after that went into a very tough lockdown, and was one of the best, and it comes out one of the best, if not the best country in the MENA region when it comes to tackling the COVID crisis. A second point I would like to touch upon is clearly globalization. So what we have seen is a lot of flows are globalized. So communication is globalized, finance is globalized, basically travel is globalized. But what we are missing is globalized security, or at least globalized initiatives in peace and security, and also globalized governance that could have, through multilateralism and really the correct use of existing international organizations, could have provided, I would say, a concerted, a coherent, and a global response to the pandemic we are facing at the moment. I think those international organizations, such as the WHO, and such as maybe WTO, in the aftermath of the crisis, tackling the financial crisis that is going to emerge, are really relevant and are really providing an added value if funded well and if used correctly also. I mean, the warnings have been there. Those institutions are working well. We should effectively, in a liberal approach where peace is at the core of the concept, we should definitely use those international organizations and the positive effects that they are providing. I know for Europe that there has been some critics about the EU not tackling or not in a coordinating way tackling the crisis. I think what we need to understand also that, when your population is at stake, a health crisis like this is not a supranational responsibility from the EU. We are going back to a vital interest of each member state, and it's up to each member state to find solutions to protect their own population. What we have seen is, in a second phase, is the EU stepping up their efforts to basically address the crisis as such. And I was really pleased to see this week that on what I called the last liberal island in the world, being Europe, to see the president of the Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, really gathering the world in trying to find a solution, at least trying to find funds that will be dedicated to finding a cure, at least to finding a vaccine to COVID-19. So I was really pleased for this. But you know, when you're touching the vital interest, when you're touching the responsibility of the member states, you are going back to some form of sovereignties. Thank you, Tom. You're going back to some form of sovereignties, but also, you know, you saw that closing the borders, everybody was trying to take care of its own problem. And then in a second and third phase, we went back again into a more European coordination of this crisis. I think a last point on this, in times of crisis, you know, before the crisis, when you live in this globalized world, it's all based, and also in a liberal approach to the globalized world, it's all based on interdependence. You know, it's what we call Pax Economica, Pax Democratica, whatever you want to call it. But I think a lot of our leaders, political leaders, have also realized now that once you shift into a crisis, and especially if you're not prepared, this interdependence turns into dependence, which is very bad for, I would say, the execution of the work of a state in normal times. And this is something that should be avoided. I think that's one of the main lessons of this crisis. You need to avoid dependence in times of crisis. When I would like to use the last 2-3 minutes to relate to the research of the Institute for Economics and Peace, and I already spoke about Positive Peace and the Positive Peace report. I will also speak shortly about the Global Peace Index, so it will be released. The 2020 edition will be released on the 10th of June, also online. What we have seen, you know, I spoke about these peace dividends and not being reinvested in peace and security. We have seen over the past decade, up to 12 years, a decrease of peacefulness by 4%. We use 23 indicators to produce the Global Peace Index. Those indicators are separated in 3 clusters, 3 families of indicators. So conflict, participation in conflict, safety and security in society, and militarization. We have seen that safety and security in societies remained at the same level over the past decade. Conflict increased. So we experienced more conflict, more fragmented conflict, but also the emergence of more and more non-state actors in those type of conflicts. The MENA region was really the driver of this decrease in peacefulness over the past decade. To the other end, we saw that militarization decreased, also less investment in militarization in the past decade. And I think globally, of course, and I think that was very, very positive, one of the positive signs of the past decade. What we also see with the Global Peace Index is the widening gap between the most peaceful countries in the world and the least peaceful countries in the world, also basically having a positive peace deficit. So they're already low and they cannot invest in more peace. So basically they are really sliding into the violence trap. And this is something we need to keep an eye on. For the Global Terrorism Index, I think it's important to look at the 2 main drivers for terrorism. The main driver for terrorism, really 90% of all terrorist attacks occurred in a country that is involved in some form of conflict. We have seen through the COVID crisis that a lot of temporary ceasefires has been installed in countries that were in conflict, and therefore less attacks and less terrorist attacks will be committed in those countries, and that is something that is really positive. On the other hand, we also see that some of the main terrorist groups in the world are now able to reorganize and maybe will come out stronger after the crisis. And we have seen in our own societies that some other forms of terrorism, like far left, far right terrorism, is also organizing, is also using the grievances that are linked to a situation like the COVID crisis to really flare them up and use them to the end, to serve their goals, and that's basically populism and destabilization. The second main driver for terrorism is political terror, and there I'm a little bit afraid of some countries, or what's happening in some countries that are really, you know, shifting power completely to government. I mean, this has happened also in Belgium, but under very strict rules. So we now have in Belgium what is called the COVID government that can only have that only has full powers to handle with COVID, and this for a limited period of time. I did not see this same democratic evolution in a lot of countries, or in all countries. 1 minute, thank you, Tom. In all countries in the EU, and I even saw this morning a report by the Freedom House that was describing some of few countries as not being democracies anymore. And I think this is something we need to be very careful about, because this is going to create grievances that could lead to the use of more extreme violence and radicalization. I think to finish, I would like to say that I'm one of the, I would say, visiting professors from IEP to the master's program in Blanquerna, and as Tom said, we create the connection between the theory and the practice. So, and I guess all the directors and all the professors that are the IEP directors and professors that are visiting the program are all specialists in their own field, and the added value that IEP is bringing to through this master's program is really to provide the students with this hands-on data-driven research, quantification and measurements of peace, but also the different effects, positive effects that comes with a more peaceful situation. So, and I think what is really, really interesting for them also is to be able to be in touch with the researchers and really being taught how to handle massive data sets and how to transform this into complex indexes, which is basically the core activity of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And I think what is going to be really, really fun in a couple of months from now is to have interns. So some of the students, one of the students of the master this year will do an internship at the office here in Brussels, at the IEP office in Brussels. And I think herself, but especially also the team in Brussels, is really looking forward to this opportunity. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A of the next 30 minutes. So thank you, Tom. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Serge. Really a lot coming out of that presentation. Again, a lot of complex thinking, but also clear ideas about what we can learn as positives while guarding against the negatives. It looks to me, Albert, if we're moving on to Q&A, that we have 2 questions at least lined up. Is that right?
Yes, that's it. And we can repeat same procedure than yesterday. And I'll share one by one as per order of what we have received. The first one comes from Paula Martí, and if I'm not wrong, hoping not, it's one of our students of this year editions, who's at the same time doing internship in Blanquerna. Welcome, Paula. Hope I'm not wrong. And her question is, what are your thoughts about the militarization that has occurred in some countries as a response to the COVID? I think that it's open to the 3 of you.
Serge?
I mean, Valeria, do you want to go first?
If you prefer to go first, you can go first. Then, because I've read also the second question, I could connect with both of them because I think they're much interrelated. So if you want to reply, then I can go.
Okay. I'll go on. I think you know when I look at my own society, the society I live in, and I've been in the military for 30 years, so I know how I've been used and abused over 30 years. For so-called peacekeeping operations, or at least security operations. I think that the military is an easy-to-go solution. I mean, this was one of the #1 solutions found after the terrorist attacks in Brussels, for example, or at least the terrorist attacks in Paris, where military came on the streets of our cities in Belgium to enhance security and basically support internal security. I think when this is a kind of measure that might be used, but should be used under very, very special circumstances, in a very restricted framework, and for a very limited period of time. One of the main tasks of the military is also support to the nation, and this is basically what the Belgian military has been doing over the past 2-3 months. Is basically supporting the efforts to cope with COVID-19. Logistics, distribution, management of goods, of those protective gears, has been distributed and stocked by the military. It's the military, because they have this experience of large public market offers that made the reservation, at least made the contract to order 12 million mouth masks for Belgium. So at least each Belgian can be distributed one mouth mask by the government. So there is also there can be a positive use of the military in such times. But it's an easy to go solution that should be restricted in time and in scope. And I think you're right, Valeria, to say that this can be linked to the second question about the role of academics. But I will definitely let you answer on this. I think already in my introduction, I spoke about this. People are listening again to specialists. And I think this is a vein we should definitely work on and continue to explore. This was different in the past. And you know, this is part of my job as a representative IEP. It's also to promote the research that we do. And I'm really looking forward to having a better response to that part of my job in the future. And I'm really pleased to see this evolution. Up to you, Valeria. Thank you.
Can I just make a quick comment before Valeria makes her response? It seems to me, I mean, this might be, I sometimes overreach for a positive in all this, but I think one of the things that, as you said, Serge, that people are beginning to listen to experts again. And in terms of, it's not so much the role of the military, but the whole kind of mentality of militarization as a security response. I think there is the beginnings of a feeling that the concept of militarization or the military role in providing security is less firm. It's being eroded. And, you know, if we look at the broader international level, we've got the UN Secretary General calling for global ceasefire. We've got, and there are the International Peace Bureau, which actually relates to the second question, talking about framing human security as a global good, so that we're looking at, I think they proposed a global compact or a global commission on peace and security. You know, a new debate at the international level, which doesn't mean that this concept of human security negates national security, but it provides an overarching value system and response. And I think that there's a very strong push that people now want to hear this debate at the global level. It relates also to the second question, but I'll hand over to Valeria to make her response, perhaps connecting the two questions.
Sorry, just in case, sorry, Valeria, to interrupt. Let me read the question in case someone has not opened the chat, asking that it is more important now for the academia work in partnership with the civil society. If so, how can it be possible in this context? Valeria?
Thank you very much, Albert, for reading the question. Yes, indeed, very much agree, Tom, with your observation, your analysis. I happen to be an expert of the securitization, so the ways of practices, policies, but also techniques and discourses, speech acts in particular, can turn a specific domain that is normally dealt with different measures into a security domain. So that is one of the field of specialization that I have, which I've particularly been investigating through the topic of migration. Now, I think this the securitization has already showed as a field of study that actually the same processes are taking place also for different fields, for different topics and areas, such as the one of health, the one of climate change. Many of the current topical issues that we are engaging with, let's say, are securitized, and there is an attempt to regain that control that the state has felt has lost because of the disconnection between power and politics that was highlighted by Bauman in its work on liquid modernity, then feels that a way to regain part of that power to act is through the securitization. So through securitizing specific domains and intervene with armed forces or with the militarization of specific governance of phenomenon. But this needs to be somehow contextualized within an sort of emergent situation, a situation of emergency, but a situation that is exceptional. And this reminds us somehow of the discussion that Giorgio Agamben, the philosopher, has brought about the state of exception and how it entails that there's more and more of exceptionality becoming normality nowadays. So the militarization is definitely a response that is somehow concerning for the reason that we do not know what would be the consequences of militarizing a sector that was before not militarized, particularly because we happen to live in some countries and in some places in democratic political environments in which we do not we're not particularly worried about the consequence of those militarization and securitization. But what happens if there are changing turns in politics? What this exceptionality brought into normality can entail for our daily life as citizens. These are issues that we, I think all as citizens very much need to be careful about and the development. And how this reminds us the specific role of academics is in highlighting the questions that are that develop from these changed normalities. And it's in that way that I see the connection with the second question, that is the one on the role of academia, because the academia has very much engaged with civil society for the past 2 or 3 decades, because there was the feeling of the urgency of getting in touch with the fields, in touch with the practitioners, in touch with those who live the experience of specific situations and feedback on what are the studies, what the mental organization of the governance of our world could bring into the practice. So what I instead agree very much with Serge and also Tom is that what this pandemic has shown is that perhaps what has been left behind was that bridge between academics and instead policy domains of where decisions were taken. So the policy making was more disconnected from the expert production, and this somehow reminds us also of what is the postmodern condition of our times. Lyotard in I think it was already the 80s when he was committed, I think, by the Canadian government to write about the postmodern condition and what entails the disconnection of knowledge from the production of policies. And the specific concern that Lyotard found was the fact that nowadays the producer of knowledge remain the experts and the intellectuals, but the place where that knowledge is located is in the hand of private actors, particularly those who are in control of the means of communications and the virtual means of communication nowadays. So that makes us wonder, if we produce that knowledge and that knowledge is then put into into a domain that is not public but is private, then the connection the disconnection is not only the disconnection between power and politics, such as the one Bauman showed in The Liquid Modernity, but it is also the disconnection between the producer of knowledge and those who dispense and circulate knowledge, which is no longer the public, but is the private. So I know I've opened perhaps even more the discussion, and I know that I really need Tom to stop me talking. So I leave it to you, Tom, to...
No, Valeria, my role is not to stop you talking. I wish we had much more time to continue listening to you and to Serge. But we're not running into an immediate time problem. It seems to me, Albert, you've been following this 3 questions potentially lined up.
We have indeed 4.
4?
I would rather suggest if there's any other immediate question to stop it here, because to answer the 4 of them will take some time, and try to keep the order of ones I've received. Let me start by the ones of Carla, saying how has pandemic affected our understanding of borders, and what will be the role of borders within and outside the EU as a protective tool?
I think we, as the questioner said, we did have this come up as a big theme yesterday. And Serge, would you mind responding to that?
No, of course not. I wouldn't mind. I think closing the borders was the first reaction, because we want to make sure the virus is not coming in. Yeah, I mean, we did it quite late because the virus was already in, because the borders were not closed. So basically, this was, I won't say a panic reaction, but that was a first reaction to make sure that no more contamination could come in, and that you can just manage what was inside your borders. But very quickly, I would say that the reality of the interconnected world we are living in kicked in and told us to reopen the borders, to really find some solutions to your economy. And this is something we discussed yesterday. You know, I spoke already about the Belgian stocks into French warehouses, and we didn't have access to this. We saw also in a second phase, exchange of patients from one country to the other. You know, when a country came close to maximum capacity with ICU in the health system, redistributed to other countries that still had capacity. I think that's also a cross-border activity. And what I'm seeing now, even in the UK, and you mentioned that yesterday, Tom, you know, this Brexit vision of those bad Central and Eastern Europeans destroying or taking all the jobs in the UK. What we see now is that special flights are organized to bring in seasonal workers back to the UK, but back also to Belgium and other European countries to basically work in agriculture, to make sure that the fruits do not perish on the trees, and basically make our economy, or some sectors of our economy, run again. So this idea of borders and closed borders was, I think, going to lockdown, but also lockdown of your own country. So first reaction, I close so I can contain and mitigate. But then when the economic reality and other realities kicks in, you need to reopen and you need to come back to some form of normality. Maybe, and I wanted to make one more comment about the previous questions about different forms of security. Of course, human security, internal security, external security, almost concentric circles. When you start using the military in all those different forms of security, in all those different circles, the lines between different forms of security are blurred. And I think this is something we need to be very careful about. I think people through this pandemic also rediscovered security and rediscovered some of the efforts or sacrifices you need to provide to achieve a certain level of security. But I think they also saw that security and insecurity can come in different forms, and even conflict can come in different forms than, you know, pure the military opposition between states, or a conflict opposing two military or two armed groups. And therefore they also realized that, and I mean, part of the population also realized that disinformation is there, fake news is there, cyber activities there also, and they see many different forms of many different risks and threats that are basically at stake for their own security. So I think they also realize, a lot of people also realize, that a pure military solution to all the problems does not exist. And therefore, I think people realize that new forms of development, new innovative forms of development, and new innovative forms of security are needed. This is where I think IEP comes in with its concept of positive peace, that is providing new forms of development, and it's providing, I would say, a systemic social development that would bring peace and security, but also the economic benefits that comes to it. And I saw that there were also questions about the EU. This is clearly, this 2% of GDP into security debate is a debate that I have that is really, really getting to my substance, because I do not understand those investments into hardware, because basically that's not really facing the real threats that are posed to our societies today. So there's clearly an investment in some defense industrial bases and in some economies. But I was also waiting for another type of answer by the EU. The EU has really focused on soft power and development and economic collaboration. And I did not hear this. I did not hear neither the EU nor member states telling, well, we have another form of security or security maintenance. So we do other type of investments than just into defense and into the military. So I was a little bit lacking this. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Can I just put a very short comment as a tail end to Serge's remarks about borders? It's a very particular English situation, and it was a story I told yesterday about this obsession with closing borders around Brexit, hard borders. That this has all been thrown in the air. If we remember the story of our Prime Minister who went into hospital, into intensive care, and had a 50-50 chance of surviving. He was saved by 3 people. We know the names of them. One was from New Zealand, one was from the Philippines, and one was from Portugal. And all of a sudden, there's now a confusion about, are these borders, is this a good idea to be cutting off skill and capacity and expertise? It's a very kind of local story, but I think it's going to have a big impact, and it's entering now the political debate. Was this such a good idea? Is it such a good idea? And can we possibly close our borders like that? So that's just a little anecdote, but I think it's going to have a big impact. Albert, you better move us on to where we need to be going.
We can have some room. Let's take 5-10 extra minutes, because we have two questions that I would like them to be answered. The first comes from Laura, and I read it. What do you think about the future of the EU as a political union, given the lack of solidarity between countries and the increasing gap between northern and southern countries, which are the most affected by the COVID-19 crisis? And the second question, do you think the EU is going to become irrelevant in the next few years, passing given the risk of disintegration?
So,
Valeria?
Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting, because actually in my course with my students, we've been looking at a variety of responses to the pandemics, but also how it is connected with other issues of inequalities. It's one of my also my main field of research, the impact of inequality, particularly as root causes of other conflict and tensions. And therefore, the students have highlighted in their works that actually not all countries have the same necessity when it comes to fight this pandemic, because they have different factors. So the WHO has had an incredibly successful way of highlighting what are the current measures that are needed, but possibly there has been in some places a lack of considerations of factors that are different from the Western conditions, and in which those that were seen as real problems in parts of the world could have been dealt differently in specific areas. For example, we have seen that the pandemics particularly hit the specific vulnerable groups of the society. So is it the same, the impact that the pandemics will have on countries that are not as elder like our societies? We know that the Western has for long now experienced an elderly population that is growing, but other places do not actually have the same kind of vulnerable, the same number of vulnerable individuals that we could have. So what are instead other measures that could be needed in places where rather than the physical conditions, the problems are the structural conditions of specific lack of possibility of keeping the same hygiene measures, such as washing hands in places where fresh water is not that accessible. So how important is actually that inequality is still put at the center of all the discussions that we have about opportunities to cope with difficulties in and challenges in our life. So I think we need to keep this into account when we look at the different cases and the different countries. Of course, there are some measures that are needed globally because of the interconnectedness. That is what definitely is based upon, but actually there are elements that are specific to each place, and this also needs to be considered, and possibly in an exchange and in an exchange of knowledge with the expert and the scholars, the intellectuals that know what could be the consequences of these interrelated issues nowadays. So I think we have to take the globality and localize the responses also according to what are the specific conditions of each country, keeping in mind that there are anyway some elements that needs to be dealt with at a global level, because that, as such, was pointed before, there is, and also Tom, there is an important element that connects everybody in this planet, and the only appropriate level to understand how to avoid that the opportunity of interconnectedness doesn't turn into a challenge is to consider those elements at the global level, that is the global one. So the response needs to be framed in at all the different level, and with the collaboration of all the actors that contribute to our life, if we want to make sure that we address intergenerational inequalities, justice takes place on the planet whenever we deal with every possible challenge. I'll leave you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria.
I'll leave it to Tom and Serge for their contribution.
Serge, do you want to add to that, or do you want to move on to?
No, I mean, just a few comments. I think that I would refer to a Financial Times interview with President Macron, where he clearly explains what COVID-19 did with the EU. He speaks about solidarity, and he speaks about his ideas of the future of the EU and the future of multilateralism. I think it's very well. It's a very well done interview, and a lot of answers can come out of this. I am always optimist, so I'm not blind for the erosion of multilateralism, and I'm not blind for the troubles the EU is going through today. I already explained before that the EU is responsible for some things, but not for everything. I think the EU has been defending liberal approaches to international relations, and is still a fierce defender of and promoter of multilateralism. I think we need to understand that also. There is a certain procedure to ask for solidarity, and and I know the opposition between North and the South was about, financial support. I mean, the ECB came in also, and the discussion was about maybe a Dutch refusal to support the Italian and the Spanish systems. But, the other end, there is also treaties. So there's Article 42.7 of the Treaty of the EU, and there is Article 122 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU that are talking about the solidarity clause, and those can be invoked, and they weren't. What I think we need to, we need to keep that into account also. What I think we need to look at is what the EU is responsible for, and clear identifying what has happened within COVID, and the different discussions between the heads of state and those massive video conferences. This is all intergovernmental, so it's a lot of discussion between the different national leaders, trying to find a consensus on each of those discussions. I think we need after a crisis, I always see international institutions becoming stronger after a crisis if they are relevant. So if the EU is relevant, I think we should go through a process of revisiting the treaties and shifting maybe more of this security towards the international organization. And some things that are now still at intergovernmental level should shift to the supranational level, where decision-making is easier, where you don't really need the consensus, and therefore then you can go into a new process for the EU. So maybe we saw resurgence of sovereignty through COVID, but this could maybe lead to giving up a little bit more of our sovereignty towards the international organizations, because I still think that a concerted and multilateral approach to such type of crisis can provide better results.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Serge. Albert, there's a question from Aina, who is one of our students, right?
I guess it's one of our students, and I forgot there's two questions. I suggest I can read both, so if all of you can take notes, and whatever you feel comfortable to answer are quite different, one from each other, but we can already be answered. The first coming from Aina. I don't know if it's one of our, I hope it's one of our students. Which kind of changes should be implemented at state level in order to improve the current indicators of positive pace of the Spanish state, taking into account the new post-pandemic scenarios? I guess that would be for Serge, as any clue. And the second one, coming from Dele Cope. What is the best possible way of explaining COVID-19 as a threat? And to what extent does it expose the limitations and capacities of traditional and non-traditional actors known in security studies?
I think clearly the first one, excuse me, it's one of our delivery people. So the first one is clearly for Serge, right? Positive peace indicators in the Spanish state. I think to a large extent Valeria has addressed aspects around the second, but perhaps you could sum up that again, Valeria, in your response to that second question. And then having taken those, we might look to winding up with Albert telling us a little bit more about the specifics of the master's degree. So Serge, for a comment on peace indicators in the Spanish state, if you can take that one, and then Valeria, and then we'll move to a conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think, yeah, you're right. I think we already answered the second one, or partially the second one, especially when we describe the different forms of security and the actors that are active in those different forms of security that are intertangled and interconnected anyhow. About the Spanish state, I think there again we are coming back to my initial comments about the difference, so the balance between preparedness and resilience. When we look at the level of positive peace of the Spanish state, as the levels would go for the same levels for other European or EU states, Spain is still at the top of the positive peace index, or at least in the first third of this index. So Spain has shown some resilience and will definitely have to draw the lessons identified of his answer. And I think this process now started, and we see more and more evaluation of the responses to the COVID threat. I guess I would advise to wait for the Global Peace Index, so launched on the 10th of June, There will be a specific chapter on COVID-19, and of course the interaction with peace and the interaction as COVID being a potential threat. And this is clear, and I already saw the draft of this, but of course I cannot talk 100% freely about what is in there. But we have clearly identified different measures taken by different governments and linked that to each of the 8 pillars and the indicators linked to each of the pillars. So this analysis is being done, has been done, and will be published with the next Global Peace Index. But I think when you look at when you go through the different pillars, you can clearly identify that all of them have been triggered by COVID-19 and the response, but some of them may be more. Of course, good governance is very, very, very important. The free flow of information. I mean, you are imposing restrictions to your population. I mean, these restrictions need to be accepted by the population, and therefore you need to have a very free flow of exact communication and communicating very well. And there has been, for example, in Belgium, a lot of criticism about the way the government was communicating about the measures they were imposing, but also the release of the lockdown measures. Development of human capital is another one that I can think of. Equitable distribution of resources. I think this is an ambition that our government, but also the EU, has shown now by investing in COVID-19 vaccine, but with a purpose to distribute this globally. So not only for the 500 million Europeans, but for the 7 billion people living on the face of this earth. So you can do the exercise, and it will be done in the GPI 2020. Go over the 8 pillars and identify the measures that have been taken, or the measures that should have been taken in the response to COVID, I would say, in relation to the resilience that is already existing, but also still to the lack of resilience to some of the domains within, or some of the pillars within positive peace. So I think this is an exercise that we are going to do, and that we could definitely do in support of any state and every nation in the world, is explaining to them how positive peace should be applied, and how, when applied well, and the interconnection between the 8 pillars, how this is providing to you high level of resilience to many, many different shocks and risks and threats, but also providing you economic, ecological, social, and governance increased indicators. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Just again, a comment on that. I suspect, I don't know, but in Aidan's question, there's probably an implicit question around the relationship between the Spanish state and the Catalan issue. And I know that ISIP, the Peace Research Institute in Barcelona, has been doing some creative thinking around that. And one of which might be to begin to play around with the pillars to see whether around governance there could be creative solutions to that particular problem. It's not a discussion for now, but Aina, you may know about that, or you may want to follow it up a bit if that is your concern within that question. And I can certainly help link you up with some people who are thinking in that way. So I think, Valeria, do you want to say, can you just conclude with some kind of response to traditional, non-traditional actors in security studies? I think you've said a lot about that already, but yeah. Do you want to take us out on that one?
Thank you very much, Paul. Tom. Yes, indeed. I've partially replied to that. It is true. What I would take the chance to comment on that is that we have often considered recently that it's not always possible to clearly identify what is the role of non-traditional actors, because sometimes these actors could be at the border between different categories. I've been particularly in one article addressed the point of who is a private actor and who is a public actor. When a public actor or a state actor can act like a non-state actor. Let's take the example of cities when they do or engage in practices that are different from the national government. So there are all these puzzling issues around who is a traditional actor or a state actor and who is a non-traditional actor or a non-state actor or private actor. What are all these differences? And in that article that I considered this, I found one way to distinguish not so much between private and public, but between the interests that they represent. So if we consider the interests, if their interests are collective or if their interests are particularistic or individual, that very much changes the kind of role that they can play in the global governance. Therefore, we have to wonder what is the responsibility and who this actor represent. Because everybody, all the actors, I'm very much in support of an interconnected governance where all actors play a role. But then when I very positively take the will to help, such as we have heard Bill Gates proposing to make available the vaccine to all individuals on the planet. That is definitely a very positive example of solidarity. But on the other side, we have to worry to consider whose role is the one of protecting citizens, particularly when it comes to very basic needs such as the one of health. Do we have to consider carefully what is the responsibility of a public actor that represent collective interest, and what is the responsibility of private actors that represent very particularistic interests? So in one written commentary that I've written in Catalan, but was published by Blanquerna some days ago, I've posted as the very definite question: who is the Machiavelli's prince in our postmodern world? That is what I would left you with. So we need to be very careful about the replies we give. And I very much thank you for the possibility to share with, that you've given me to share with you this thought I have.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Serge and Valeria. I think we do need to wrap up now, and we I think really remains perhaps if Albert would give a little bit of steer on the master's degree and some of the specifics, and then we can bring our webinar to a close.
Sure, thanks, Tom. For sure, we as both EAP and Blanquerna should take the challenge to discuss, debate, propose what are the contemporary new trends that this pandemic is affecting us. But as our joint product is the masters, it's also the proof that we're taking the challenge. We're trying day by day to get adapted, and how our program can get adapted on the next edition. This one, as some of the students were present in this webinar, has been affected on the day-by-day basis. We could only to move to an online mode, and little to be changed in terms of content and syllabus. Our effort needs to be bigger for next editions, for being contemporary on the challenges, on the debates. So that's our purpose on the exercise. So I would like to take the opportunity just to briefly present the masters. As per the chat, you have seen both the links on the having more information on the promotional video, but I would like just to briefly mention that this masters has several added values. First of all, it's multidisciplinary approach for both. One, its contents. We have different modules trying to take into account the harmonization of contents in terms of historical, philosophical, academical, international relations perspectives on peace, conflicts, and security concepts, trying to harmonize all levels, because knowing that all the students are coming from different backgrounds, interests, and it's really interesting to get this harmonization. Then we need to tackle all these concepts, so what concept this building entails, from a theoretical concept, from the conflict resolution, from the analysis on conflict, from the peace building perspectives, through different issues, but specifically the cross-cutting issues that, if even this edition, 1920 edition, has tried to discuss the perspectives in terms of human rights, indigenous rights, militarization, gender, climate change, we need for sure to entail and tackle the COVID-19 pandemic in different perspectives, but also a multidisciplinary approach in terms of quite broad of really expert lectures from both academic and practitioner sides, with brought different methodologies that are coming to Barcelona to attend and deliver their expertise through the different lectures with a different diverse methodology. For sure, theoretical content is shared, with plenty of interesting readers from their own exercises, different methodological tools are being shared and are being experienced by the students. For sure, this masters wants to share the knowledge with a full range of internships proposals that aims to take in CAT, and for sure trying to guide the students on the future professional background in order to first a final master project which can help you on her academical path, but also to guide them if they wish to future steps they would like to take. It's important to raise the question, how is it possible that this master takes place? Would it be possible? For sure. Today it's the 7th of May. We have plenty of uncertainties above us only for this afternoon, for tomorrow, for next month. So the initial date of the next edition, which is October 2020, is still maintained. We hope to be done. But both IEP and Blanquerna will do their best to maintain the best quality of its masters, especially and started when it's necessary to be done. We will have to postpone a bit in order to allow the maximum number of students to attend. Once the borders are open, we will done. So we hope that we will find the best solution on that. And it's everything from my side. If the rest doesn't have anything else to add, I'd like to first thank you very much, Tom, Valeria, and Serge, for both the quality of the interventions, the debate raised, the questions is a good example of that, but the commitment and flexibility to attend and be here with us. And for sure, the audience, the different spectators, for attending this morning session of this webinar, and for the level of the debate that I think is also has been really interesting. So if there is any other questions, I'd like to close the session and thank you very much.